So tonight, what we're going to do, I don't really have any talking points here tonight. There is much going on in the world that we could, in fact, talk about, but going to kind of bypass those here tonight and kind of get us on track in the Gospel of Mark. We missed last week, and so when that happens, as unfortunate as it does somewhat affect the schedule, and I want to keep us on schedule so that we can finish the Gospel of Mark. We will finish. I don't want it to take so long that we just feel like we've been in Mark forever. Sometimes when you do a survey, that is in fact what happens. And what I mean by that is I don't want to take a break from Mark just to come back to Mark, especially since we're so close to the end. We are in chapter 12. We finished up chapter 11 the last time that I was online. Here tonight we're going to look very briefly through verses 1 through 12, and then we're going to look at verses 13 and following. And really what's going on at this stage well, I kind of need to back up and just remind us where we are in the story of Jesus. Jesus has entered into Jerusalem, and by this point, we're still talking early in the week, perhaps Tuesday, maybe even early Wednesday. But Jesus has already cleansed the temple. He's already taught his disciples. Mark has told us that Jesus is going back and forth from the city to Bethany. He's told us all those things, and one of the things that we've also observed is that, particularly at both at the entrance, oh goodness, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and also at the cleansing of the temple, the religious leaders expressed their dissatisfaction with these things. Well, that dissatisfaction continues. I don't think Mark is suggesting that that's where the conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders began, but he is saying in chapter 12 that it was that conflict became contention, that that battle between the Cold War became a real conflict. And so by chapter 12, Jesus is even in his parables, he's calling out the religious leaders, and the religious leaders perceive this very clearly. I think one of the ironies that the gospel writers, sorry about that, folks, I got you on a table here tonight, and sometimes my foot or my hand knocks the camera, and that's where the shakiness comes from. Apologize for that. The irony I'm talking about is the fact that the disciples of Jesus who would write the Gospels, they talk about how there were times they didn't understand Jesus. There were times that he said confusing things, and in many ways they struggled to understand his message, even up to the point the night of his arrest. They really did not understand what Jesus had come to do. The religious leaders, on their hand, now I'm not going to argue that they understood that they understood the disciples. They understood Jesus better than the disciples. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. But what I am saying is the gospel writers seem to be telling us that the religious leaders didn't have any trouble understanding Jesus, especially when he was criticizing them or calling them out for something. So what I mean by that is at the beginning of chapter 12 is the parable of the vine growers, and I'm not actually going to read it. I'm going to pick it up in verse 10 here in a moment, but I will summarize the story of the parable. Basically, Jesus tells the story about a man who owned a field, and he commissioned some of his servants to take care of that field. He planted the field, and it was their job to take care of the field and to harvest when the time came. And so they, in fact, do that. Well, the owner of the field sends another servant to go and to get what is owed to him. Well, the servants of the master, the servants of the field, I guess I should say, they don't want to give what is rightfully the master's, and so they beat up the servants that the master sends to collect, and beat them up, send them back, and the servant says, "I'm sorry, they're not going to give, and they mistreated me." They do it again. They mistreat him. Finally, the owner of the field sends his son, saying to himself, and this is not to read it, but to summarize. He said, the owner of the field says, "Surely they will listen to my son." And so he sends his son, and they conspire to not only beat the son up, but to also to kill the son. Jesus takes that parable, and then he makes this application. This is verse 10 of Mark chapter 12. "Have you not read this scripture? A stone which the builders rejected, this has become the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Jesus here is quoting from the Old Testament prophecy about a stone that would be rejected, and he's making a particular comment and interpretation on that prophetic word, saying that the stone is a person that the Jews would reject, but would become, as he says, as it says rather, the chief cornerstone, or the most important cornerstone. Now, in the ancient world, and it's not entirely different today. I'm not an expert in building, but having worked a few years now in construction, I somewhat understand what it means to have a cornerstone. In ancient times, when a building was being built, foundations were not like they are today, but there would have been some kind of foundation that would have been made, and it may have just been the dirt that they were building on. But somewhere in that construction, there was, and a lot of times it was a block. It was that first block that was laid, and everything was built off of it. Every measurement was taken from it, and every other block was laid from that first stone. So a chief cornerstone, or a first stone that was, or the most important stone, was indeed that cornerstone. In modern times, of course, we still build with bricks, of course, although they're not like the bricks of the first century world. But a lot of times a building is set out on paper, in the mind of the architect or the designer, before any construction is even commenced. And a lot of times when crews show up on a job site, one of the first things that they're looking for zero. Where is my starting point? Where is that true point where I can take a measurement from, where I can start to build, whether it's my walls or my electrical or my plumbing or whatever it might be. And so, that's that old saying that the more things change, the more they stay the same. We don't necessarily have a chief cornerstone in building today, but especially when you are laying the foundation today, you have to know where grade is, you have to know where zero is, you have to know where to begin in order to finish and reach the end of a project. Here Jesus is bringing that Old Testament passage, and they clearly understand that Jesus is making a claim about himself. The reason I say that is because in verse 12 we read that they were seeking to seize him, and yet they feared the people, for they understood that he told the parable against them, so they left him and went away. In a lot of ways, chapter 12 is a continuation of when the religious authorities, and go back, look at verses 27 and following, where it says that the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, they came to him. You remember they questioned Jesus about his authority, and you remember if you know if you know the passage, you know that Jesus said, I'll answer you if you answer my question. Of course, and then he asked them about John the Baptist. Was he from heaven or was he of man? And the religious leaders, they will not answer Jesus because they know if they say if he's of God, Jesus will say, well, why didn't you listen to him? And if they say of man, then it would incite the people. And so it says that they were afraid of the people there. And again, they're motivated by the fear of the people, knowing that Jesus is popular. People want to listen to him. And I think that kind of explains, I think that one of the reasons that Mark shares these little details about the scheming of the religious leaders is because of the way that Jesus' arrest and trial finally plays out. In a lot of ways, Jesus' arrest, his trial, and even his death in many ways was conducted, I'm not going to say in secret, but it was conducted with such haste and such maneuvering as not to incite the people too much. The religious leaders were very careful about that. And this was not the opportunity. That's why it says there in verse 12, they were seeking to seize him, yet they feared the people. They said, this is not the time, and this is not the place. But they clearly understand that, as it says there in verse 12, he told the parable against them. And so this is clearly an example of the text telling us what the parable means. Jesus tells the story almost as an allegory to explain how the religious leaders have abused God's messengers. And now that God's Son has arrived, they seek to kill him. It's prophetic in that way. And that's why Jesus quotes a prophetic passage from the Old Testament that particularly bears out the meaning that he is that chief cornerstone, that one who has come. And it is, as the passage says, marvelous, wonderful in our eyes. Well, this conflict, this contention, it continues in verses 13 and following. I will read, and I'm reading from Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 13. It says, Then they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to him in order to trap him in a statement. Now, we've encountered the Pharisees before, and I'll have to go back and look at my notes. I can't remember if in Mark's Gospel we have encountered the Herodians or not. If we have not, then all I will say is that the Herodians were more of a political group than a religious group. There was I don't want to get all up into it. It's not really worth the time. Basically, Herod and that line of Jewish kings was people. The people generally did not receive the Herods as their king. One of the first reasons is because they actually were not Jewish. That was one of the problems. The other problem was that the people understood rightly that the Herods were sort of installed because of Roman power. They were more, they drew their support directly from Caesar, and they basically were there to ensure that the people abided by Roman authority. And so in many ways the Herods represented Roman authority, but there were a group within ancient Palestine who were pro-Herod, and they were pro-Rome, and that's what that means there when it talks about the Herodians. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were the largest religious group within ancient Palestine during that time. The Pharisees were very what I would argue conservative in their theology. They believed the Old Testament to be the Word of God. They were anticipating the coming of Messiah. They were traditional in that they held to what we might call a strict view of the Old Testament law. They were, in many ways, the ones that might have had conflict with particularly the Herodians. But here in verse 13, they are united in their attempt to trap Jesus. So let's see what trap they're going to lay for Jesus. They came to him and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and do not care what anyone thinks, for you are not partial to anyone, but you teach the way of God in truth. Is it permissible to pay a poll tax to Caesar or not?" The irony here is that a political group and a religious group come to Jesus with a question that really challenges both the political and the religious. In America, sometimes we have contentions between political ideas and opinions and religious ideas and opinions. And so I think there's some lessons to be drawn from this passage, but let's not miss how Jesus takes this trap and he's not caught up in it. As a matter of fact, he answers in such a way to dismiss the attempt to trap Jesus. Sorry, there's, like I said, noisy neighborhood. I hear something there in the background. So the question is about a poll tax, and there were different kinds of taxes there in ancient Palestine. Yes, they had taxes all the way back there in the first century. As a matter of fact, they paid a lot of taxes. This was one of the reasons that the Jews were kind of at odds with Roman authority, is because of the taxes that they had to pay. And so one of the ideas that particularly traditional Jews had was that they didn't have to pay taxes or they shouldn't have to pay taxes to go and support a pagan king in another land. Jewish money should go to support Jerusalem, not Rome. Excuse me. I should have brought some water out here. And of course, Rome had different ideas about who the Jews should pay their taxes to. Well, this is how Jesus answers this contentious question. Are we to pay or are we not? But he, that is Jesus, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, Why are you testing me? Notice how he calls them out. Bring me a denarii to look at. A denarii was about a day's wages. It was a coin. It was something that someone would have had on them and in their possession. It would have been easy to produce and to show and let Jesus look at it. A very valuable piece of currency in Jesus' day. And here Jesus is looking at it. Now, I've seen pictures of denarii, and it is just a very simple coin. Possibly gold, possibly silver, but more than likely it was a mixed alloy, and would have had different worth to different people. As a matter of fact, I'm not an expert in economics. I'm especially not an expert in currency. All my life, what has been valuable as money has been, we have coins, yes, but we also have paper, and that is what we have today. And like today in Jesus' day, on that denarii there would have been an image of the one who gave the legitimacy to that currency. If you've been keeping up with the things that have unfolded in the recent death of Queen Elizabeth, one of the things that has to happen is that all of the currency in Great Britain is going to have to be reissued. Now, again, and I know I say this a lot, I'm not an expert in in British currency. I don't know if they have to go out and everybody's got to bring back their British pounds and exchange them for different, but the currency, the pounds, which is what I understand to be coins and paper, just like here in the United States, but it has a picture of the current reigning monarch, and so for the last few decades, several decades, as a matter of fact, Great Britain has not had to print money other than just to be printing money, because it was the same person, of course, Queen Elizabeth. But now, of course, that has changed, and every new piece of currency is going to have the image of King Charles. Did I get that right? My apologies, Your Majesty, if I did not. So, but I digress. In the first century world, in Jesus' day, it would have had an image of Caesar. And so, in verse 16, it says they brought one to him, and he said to them, "Whose image and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." And so Jesus, and only the way that Jesus can do this, responds in verse 17, "Pay to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were utterly amazed. We're going to stop there tonight as far as how far we take it in the text. The contention, the conflict, it continues in verses 18 and following with the Sadducees. But just to kind of make a few comments here in this passage, I think that when commentators read this exchange about the poll tax, a lot of times they're looking for the Bible's secrets to our political questions. You know, should we pay taxes? Should we be supportive of our political leaders? Jesus here is making a statement. Number one, I think we need to recognize he does it to dismiss the hypocritical trap of the Herodians and the Pharisees. And so I think if all we're looking for here is a political solution to our problems, I think we'll be disappointed. Jesus here is not offering necessarily sort of a rock solid political ethic to help us answer the question whether we should or should not pay taxes. Paul in Romans seems to answer that a little bit more directly, saying yes, in fact, we should pay our taxes. We should be good citizens in general. There's a lot more to say on that topic, but I want to focus on what's going on here. In a lot of ways, what Jesus is doing is he is picking up a denarius. As I said, it represented about a day's wage for a worker there in ancient Palestine, and so it was valuable. It was very valuable. It's what people worked for. It's what they used to pay for the food that they put on the table, the food they used to build their houses, the money they used to build their houses, pay for the things that they needed. With it, they could they could eat and they could have shelter, but without it, they would struggle. What Jesus is doing here is he is putting into perspective about what is truly valuable. He's making a distinction between things that belong to Caesar and things that belong to God. And so he is saying here in essence that God is not interested in a tax per se, but he is interested in our lives. He is interested in the devotion of our lives. He's interested in the character of our lives. He's interested in our thoughts, our feelings. He's interested in the day-to-day. God is over Caesar. That is the implication here. Very clearly, Jesus is saying that, yes, this thing that indeed we do place a great deal of worth upon, it belongs to a mere man. A Caesar happens to be his name. But what belongs to God? That is the clear question that comes up in this passage. And the reason the reason that the Herodians and the Pharisees are amazed at what Jesus is saying, the reason that they can't respond, the reason that their trap is kind of sprung on themselves, is because they know if they begin to argue with Jesus about the things that belong to God, they are going to have to eventually circle back into the questions about who Jesus is. If indeed God, there are things that pertain to God, and there are things that belong to God in a greater sense than the way that things pertain to the king, or the way that, or the understanding that people have that they belong to the king. Eventually, it's going to come back around to the question of who Jesus is, who he truly is, and whether or not they accept that or not. And so I think that's why the Herodians and the Pharisees, they don't take this conversation any further. They don't question Jesus further. They don't. First of all, they were not genuine in their inquiry. They don't really want to prove a point other than what it is, and here's the final application, and here's the lesson. Whether it's Jesus in his day talking about Roman taxes and things that pertain to God, or in 2022 we're talking about issues in which we argue at great length about. And there's no shortage of those things. What we need to understand is that it is number one, it's wrong to get caught up in those debates and those arguments. Now, we can have opinions, and we can even have conversations with people who are truly interested, but to get caught up in mere debate for debate's sake. And I think that this is one way in which our culture is different from the first century. In the first century, they didn't have the news media, and they did not have social media, and they did not have the talking heads like we do today. Today, there is no shortage of people who are willing to ask these contentious questions that people just go on and on and on about. In a very short time, we're going to have a midterm election. And so right now, whether you're online or you're watching TV over the air or through cable, you're getting inundated by political ads. And it's within the first few seconds, if you pay attention, you can pretty much surmise who is paying for the ad. Now, it may be a surprise who is directly paying for the ad, but you know who the ad is meant to help, and who the ad is probably meant to hurt. When I was, I have noticed a little bit, and I don't want to chase this rabbit any more than this. I've noticed a little bit that political ads have become a little bit more savvy. They'll talk about an issue without mentioning a candidate, sometimes directly. When I was a kid, and even just a few years ago, pretty much political ads were trashing. The political candidates were trashing one another. Here today, they still do that for the most part, but ads have become just maybe a teensy bit more savvy. What I'm saying is, I just hope that we never think that that is an effective means to communicate the gospel. I don't think it's our job to spend millions of dollars on some kind of ad campaign which trashes other religions and tries to just bring up questions that really people struggle with in such a way that, and to suggest that it can be answered in 30 seconds on a YouTube ad. That is preposterous. Here I think that the mistake that the Herodians and the Pharisees make is thinking that they can defeat Jesus in sound bites and public spectacle. And they cannot. But the surprise here And the thing that we cannot ignore is that Jesus is not willing to win by sound bites or public spectacle. Rather, he has come to do something much, much greater. Well, that's a good place to stop tonight, especially as we're out of time and it's actually getting dark outside. Very soon, I'll be in the dark and you won't be able to see me. So this is probably a good place to stop tonight. Until we meet again. God bless. Thank you for tuning in tonight.